Billionaire asked why his maid missed work. What he discovered left him in tears. Alexander Chen stood in his penthouse kitchen at 6:47 a.m., staring at the empty coffee pot with an unfamiliar sensation creeping through his chest: confusion. For 3 years, since the day he'd hired Maria Santos, his mornings had followed the same flawless rhythm. By 6:30, the aroma of freshly brewed Colombian coffee would fill the air. By 6:45, she'd have his breakfast prepared exactly how he liked it. By 7 o'clock, he'd be reviewing market reports while eating, never once having to think about the invisible hands that made his life run so smoothly. But this morning, the kitchen was dark, silent, cold. Alexander pulled out his phone, his jaw tightening as he scrolled to Maria's contact. His finger hovered over the call button, and for a moment, something made him pause. In 3 years, Maria had never missed a single day. Not one. She'd worked through holidays when he'd told her she could take off. She'd stayed late countless times without complaint when he'd hosted last-minute business dinners. She'd been so reliable that he'd almost forgotten she was a real person with a life beyond these walls. He pressed call. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Her soft voice, slightly accented, polite and professional. "Hello, you've reached Maria. I cannot answer right now. Please leave a message." "Maria, this is Mr. Chen. You're not here this morning, and I wasn't informed of any time off. Please call me back as soon as possible." He kept his voice measured, professional, though irritation simmered beneath the surface. He had 3 back-to-back meetings today, and he needed everything to run smoothly. The call never came. By 8:30 a.m., Alexander was pacing his office, his concentration shattered. His assistant had fielded 2 calls from him already, asking if Maria had contacted the household management service. Nothing. It was so unlike her that his irritation was slowly transforming into something else. Concern, perhaps, though he wouldn't name it that. At 10:15, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He canceled his lunch meeting, pulled up the employee records on his secure tablet, and found Maria's home address. He'd never been there. Never even thought about where she went when she left his pristine world each evening. The address was in a part of the city he rarely visited, the kind of neighborhood his car usually drove through without stopping, where buildings wore their age like battle scars and hope seemed to hang by a thread. The drive took 35 minutes, each mile taking him further from the gleaming towers of his usual world. His silver Tesla looked absurdly out of place as he pulled up to a weathered apartment complex. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin. A rusted playground sat empty in the courtyard, one swing hanging by a single chain. Children's voices echoed from somewhere above, mixing with the sounds of a city that never quite slept. Alexander climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, his Italian leather shoes clicking against concrete that had cracked years ago. Apartment 3C. He raised his hand to knock, then heard it, a sound that made his knuckles freeze in midair. A baby crying. Not the angry wail of a tantrum, but something weaker, more desperate. And beneath it, a woman's voice, breaking with exhaustion. "Please, mi amor, please. Mama's here. Mama's here." "Maria." He knocked, softly at first, then louder when the crying continued. Footsteps shuffled toward the door. A long pause. Then the door cracked open, security chain still attached, and Maria's face appeared in the gap. Alexander barely recognized her. The woman who always arrived at his home impeccably neat, with her hair pulled back and her uniform pressed, looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, dark circles like bruises underneath. Her hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. She wore a faded t-shirt stained with what looked like milk and tears. "Mr. Chen." Her voice cracked on his name. Shock, embarrassment, and fear flashed across her face in rapid succession. I'm so sorry. I should have called. I meant to." "Maria." He cut her off, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" She opened her mouth to respond, to probably offer some professional excuse, but at that moment, the baby's cry intensified into something that sounded almost like pain. Maria's face crumpled, and she turned away from the door, forgetting to close it as she rushed back inside. Alexander stood in the doorway, uncertain. Then, breaking every rule of professional boundaries he'd ever maintained, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was tiny, what his real estate agents would call a cozy studio, but what was really just one room divided by desperation and necessity. A kitchenette occupied one corner, barely large enough for a single person to stand in. A futon that served as both couch and bed sat against one wall. And in the corner, a small crib that looked like it had been assembled and reassembled too many times. But what struck him most was how clean everything was. Despite the obvious poverty, despite the peeling wallpaper and the window that wouldn't quite close all the way, Maria had maintained the same standards here that she brought to his penthouse. Every surface was scrubbed. Dishes were neatly stacked. A small vase held wildflowers that must have been picked from somewhere free. Maria stood beside the crib, lifting a small bundle into her arms. The baby, he could see now it was a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 months old, was red-faced and screaming, her tiny body radiating heat that Alexander could feel from across the room. "She's burning up," Maria whispered, more to herself than to him. She swayed instinctively, rocking the baby, but her movements were mechanical, exhausted. "I've been trying to bring her fever down all night. I gave her medicine. I used cool cloths. Her voice broke. Nothing's working." Alexander watched as Maria sank onto the edge of the futon, cradling her daughter against her chest. The baby's cries had weakened to whimpers now, and somehow that was even more frightening. "Have you taken her to a doctor?" The question came out sharper than he'd meant it to. Maria's laugh was hollow. "I took her to the clinic yesterday. They said it's just a virus, that it has to run its course. But Mr. Chun, she's getting worse, not better. Her fever was 103 this morning, and she looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw the absolute terror in her eyes. "I don't know what to do. I used the last of my emergency money for the clinic visit yesterday. I can't afford to go back unless it's life or death, and I keep telling myself she'll get better. She has to get better. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm waiting too long because I can't afford?" She couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of it hung in the air between them. Alexander's mind, trained to process information and make decisions worth millions in seconds, suddenly felt slow and useless. He was looking at a reality he'd never had to confront. Maria worked for him 50 hours a week, and apparently that wasn't enough to afford basic health care for her child. Maria, who kept his life running with such seamless perfection that he'd taken her completely for granted. "Get her things," he said abruptly. "Whatever she needs. We're taking her to the hospital." "Mr. Chin, I can't." "That wasn't a request, Maria." His voice carried the authority that closed billion-dollar deals, but for once, it wasn't about power. "Get her things. Now." "My car is downstairs." The emergency room at Presbyterian Medical Center moved with controlled chaos. Alexander had insisted on bringing Maria to the private hospital where his company's executives received care, not the overwhelmed public clinic she'd visited the day before. Within minutes of arriving, Maria and her daughter, Sophia, he'd learned her name was, had been ushered into an examination room. Alexander sat in the pristine waiting area, surrounded by abstract art and a coffee station that served organic fair-trade beans, and felt completely out of his depth. This was a world he could control with his wallet, but he couldn't control the gnawing feeling in his chest as he watched Maria through the glass partition, her whole body curved protectively around her daughter as a nurse took Sophia's temperature. His phone buzzed. His assistant, wondering where he was. A board member, requesting feedback on a merger. An investor, following up on last night's email. The digital demands of his empire, all of them suddenly feeling distant and inconsequential. He silenced the phone. 45 minutes later, a doctor emerged, Dr. Patricia Winters, according to her badge, with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Are you the father?" she asked Alexander. "No, He paused, uncertain how to define his relationship to Maria. "I'm her employer." Dr. Winters's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been judgment or merely assessment. "I see. Well, The baby has a severe ear infection that's progressed to the point of concern. Her fever is 104.2. If it had gone much longer without proper treatment, we could have been looking at a much more serious situation, potential hearing damage or worse. Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach. But she'll be okay now. With proper antibiotics and monitoring, yes. We're going to keep her overnight for observation and for fluids to make sure the fever comes down. The mother is exhausted. When did she last sleep? I don't know. She needs rest too. This kind of stress, the lack of sleep, it's not sustainable. Dr. Winters studied him with those penetrating eyes. The mother mentioned she couldn't afford to come back to the clinic. Is there a reason she doesn't have health insurance? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. I don't know. Dr. Winters nodded slowly, as if she'd heard this answer before and found it disappointing every time. I'm going to send in our financial counselor to discuss payment options. For now, both mother and baby need rest. After the doctor left, Alexander made his way to the examination room. Maria was sitting in a chair beside a hospital crib where Sophia now slept, and 4-line attached to her tiny hand. The baby's face was still flushed, but her breathing had settled into a more peaceful rhythm. Maria looked up as he entered, and immediately started to stand. Mr. Chen, I can't thank you enough. Please sit, he said, pulling up another chair. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching Sophia's chest rise and fall. 3 years, Alexander finally said. You've worked for me for 3 years, and I didn't know you had a daughter. Maria's hands twisted in her lap. I didn't want to burden you with my personal life. You hired me to do a job, not to... Maria. He turned to face her fully. Why don't you have health insurance? Her cheeks flushed. The agency I work through, they classify us as independent contractors. It's cheaper for them that way. No benefits, no insurance, no sick days. I've been saving for it, trying to, but childcare costs and rent. She trailed off, the mathematics of survival too bleak to put into words. Your contract says you work 40 hours a week for me. Yes. But you work at least 50. Sometimes 60 during busy periods. Maria's silence was confirmation. I've never paid you overtime. You pay what the agency says. The agency takes a cut, don't they? What percentage? She hesitated. 30%. Alexander's jaw clenched. The numbers were spinning through his head now. If the agency took 30% and Maria worked an average of 50 hours a week at the rate he thought he was paying, she was making barely above minimum wage. In one of the most expensive cities in the country. As a single mother. Sophia's father, he asked quietly. Gone. Left when I told him I was pregnant. Maria's voice was matter-of-fact, worn smooth by acceptance. It's just us. It's always been just us. And today? Why didn't you call? This was when Maria's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face, though she tried to wipe them away quickly, maintaining professionalism even now. Your house rules, she whispered. No children allowed on the property. You made that very clear when you hired me. I have a neighbor, Mrs. Chun, no relation to you, who watches Sophia while I work. But she's 83 years old, and yesterday she fell. Nothing serious, thank God, but she can't watch Sophia anymore. And I couldn't bring her to work, and I couldn't leave her alone, and I couldn't afford to miss a day because I'm already behind on rent, and... She was spiraling now, the weight of impossible choices crushing her. I didn't know what to do, she continued, her voice breaking. I thought maybe if I could get her fever down, maybe by tomorrow Mrs. Chen would feel better, or maybe I could find someone, or maybe... I kept thinking I just needed one more day, just one more day, but she kept getting worse and I was so scared, and I'm so sorry, Mr. Chen. I'm so sorry. Alexander sat there, this man who'd built an empire on calculated decisions and emotional distance, and felt something inside him fundamentally shift. He was seeing Maria, truly seeing her for the first time, not as the silent, efficient presence who maintained his comfort, but as a whole person. A mother fighting battles he'd never had to imagine. A woman who'd spent 3 years making his life effortless while her own was coming apart at the seams. No children allowed on the property, he repeated slowly. I said that. When you hired me, yes. You said your home was a professional space and needed to remain that way. He remembered now. He'd been 30, newly successful, and ridiculously self-important. He'd wanted his life to run like a machine, with no messy human complications. Maria, I need you to listen to me. He waited until she met his eyes. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. Do you understand? You're an extraordinary mother doing your best in an impossible situation, a situation that I've apparently been contributing to without realizing it. You've been generous. I've been blind, he corrected firmly. And that ends now. First, Sophia is going to get every bit of treatment she needs. I'll handle all the medical bills. Mr. Chen, I can't accept. You're not accepting charity. You're accepting what should have been provided to you from the start, proper compensation and benefits. He pulled out his phone, already composing an email to his CFO. Effective immediately, you're no longer working through the agency. You're a direct employee of mine, with full health benefits, paid time off, and overtime compensation for every hour over 40 you work. Your salary is going to reflect your actual value, not whatever exploitative rate that agency was getting away with. Maria stared at him, speechless. Furthermore, that rule about no children, it's gone. Sophia is welcome in my home anytime you need to bring her. We have 7 bedrooms that sit empty 90% of the time. We can convert one into a nursery or play area, whatever works best. I don't understand, Maria whispered. Why are you doing this? Alexander looked at Sophia, this tiny human being he'd never known existed until a few hours ago, and then at Maria, whose hands were still trembling slightly from exhaustion and fear. Because I've been living in a bubble, he said honestly. A very expensive, very comfortable bubble where I convinced myself that as long as I paid what I was told to pay, I was doing enough. I never asked questions. I never looked deeper. I benefited from your work without ever considering the cost of that work to you. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. My father built the foundation of my company before he died. He was brilliant, ruthless, and completely focused on success. But there's something he told me once that I forgot somewhere along the way. He said, anyone can profit from someone else's labor. It takes actual character to ensure that your success doesn't come at the cost of someone else's dignity. Maria wiped her eyes, her expression a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. I'm going to do better, Alexander continued. Not because it makes me feel good, though I hope it does eventually, but because it's what should have been happening all along. You've taken care of me for 3 years, Maria. It's time I actually took care of you. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman in professional attire entered, introducing herself as the financial counselor. Alexander stood immediately. Send all bills directly to me, he said, handing her his business card. Alexander Chen. And ensure that Ms. Santos and her daughter have whatever they need during their stay. The woman glanced at the card, and her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the name. Of course, Mr. Chen. Right away. After she left, Maria looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You didn't have to come today. You could have just fired me and hired someone else. Is that what you thought I would do? I don't know, she admitted. I've worked for many people before you, Mr. Chen. Most of them, they don't see us. We're furniture that occasionally needs replacing. I learned not to expect anything else. Her words settled over him like a weight, a mirror showing him a reflection he didn't want to recognize but couldn't ignore. I'm sorry, he said simply. I'm sorry it took your daughter getting this sick for me to see you. Really see you. Sophia stirred in her sleep, making a small sound. Instantly, Maria was on her feet, checking her temperature with the back of her hand in a gesture so instinctive it must have been repeated thousands of times. She feels a little cooler, Maria said, relief evident in her voice. The doctor said you need rest too, Alexander reminded her. When did you last eat? She thought about it. Yesterday morning, I think. Maria. I was going to, she said defensively. But then Sophia got worse, and I was so worried, and food just didn't seem important. Alexander was already on his phone. I'm having food delivered. And you're going to eat, and then you're going to sleep. I'll stay with Sophia. You can't. You must have work. Work can wait, he said, and realized he meant it. For the first time in his professional life, something mattered more than the next deal, the next meeting, the next million. I'll stay until you've rested. That's not a request, Maria. I may have been a terrible employer until today, but I'm still your employer, and right now I'm telling you to take care of yourself. A small smile crossed her exhausted face. You're very bossy. So I've been told. He smiled back. Usually people call it executive presence. They're being polite. It was such an unexpected moment of humor that they both laughed quietly, careful not to wake Sophia. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Not the breaking down of professional boundaries, but the recognition of shared humanity. The food arrived 20 minutes later, far more than two people could eat, because Alexander had never learned to order reasonably. Maria ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as her body reminded her of what it needed. Alexander watched Sophia sleep, this tiny person he hadn't known existed this morning, and wondered how many other invisible struggles happened every day in the shadows of his privilege. The hospital room had settled into a peaceful quiet by the time darkness fell. Sophia's fever had dropped to 101.2, still elevated, but a significant improvement. The antibiotics were working. Maria had finally succumbed to exhaustion on the fold-out chair that the nurses had converted into a makeshift bed. Her breathing was deep and even, the kind of sleep that comes only after the body has pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Alexander sat in the chair beside Sophia's crib, his laptop open but ignored. He'd told his assistant he would be unavailable for the rest of the day, another first. The messages kept coming, piling up unread. A crisis at the Singapore office. A question about the quarterly projections. Someone wanted his input on a new hire. All of it felt distant, happening in a world that suddenly seemed less real than this small hospital room. Sophia stirred, her tiny fist curling and uncurling in her sleep. She was beautiful, he realized. Her face was still flushed from fever, but he could see the delicate features, the long eyelashes resting against her cheeks. She looked like Maria, the same olive skin, the same determined set to her jaw even in sleep. A nurse came in to check vitals, moving with practiced quiet. She smiled at Alexander. You're doing a good job, Dad. I'm not. He started to correct her, then stopped. What was he exactly? I'm a friend of the family. The nurse checked Sophia's temperature and made notes on her chart. Well, she's lucky to have you. Both of them are. After she left, Alexander found himself thinking about luck. He'd always attributed his success to intelligence, hard work, strategic thinking. But sitting here in the dim hospital light, he was confronting a truth he'd avoided his whole life. He'd been born lucky. Born to parents who could afford the best schools. Born with connections that opened doors before he'd even knocked. Born into a world where a sick child meant an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Maria had worked just as hard as him, maybe harder. But she'd been born into different circumstances, and that had made all the difference. His phone buzzed. His mother, calling from her villa in Monaco. He silenced it, but the interruption reminded him of something. He pulled up his contacts and called his personal attorney. Marcus, I need you to draft some documents for me. At 9 p.m. on a Thursday? Marcus sounded amused. Must be important. It is. I'm going to dictate the details, and I need everything ready by tomorrow afternoon. For the next 20 minutes, Alexander outlined his requirements while Marcus took notes. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Alexander, Marcus said carefully, you're sure about this? These are significant changes to your household employment structure. I've never been more sure of anything. All right. I'll have everything ready by 2 p.m. tomorrow. You're going to need to sign in person. I'll bring everything to you. After hanging up, Alexander stood and walked to the window. The city sprawled below, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one carrying their own struggles he'd never considered. How many Mariahs were out there, invisible to people like him. You're still here. He turned to find Maria awake, watching him with clear eyes. She looked better. The rest had done her good, even if it had only been a few hours. I said I would stay, he replied. She sat up slowly, immediately looking towards Sophia's crib. She's sleeping?
Yes.
Fever's down. The nurse said she's doing well. Maria's shoulders sagged with relief, and Alexander saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer. She stood and walked to the crib, gazing down at her daughter with an expression of such pure love that Alexander felt like an intruder witnessing it. Mr. Chen, she said softly, not taking her eyes off Sophia. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I first came to this country, I had nothing. I was 21, pregnant, and running from a situation I don't want to discuss. I spoke almost no English. I had $200 and a suitcase. She touched Sophia's tiny hand gently. I worked 3 jobs while I was pregnant. Cleaning offices at night, washing dishes at a restaurant, folding clothes at a laundromat. I slept 4 hours a night and saved every penny I could for when she came. Alexander listened, not interrupting. When Sophia was born, I was alone. No family, no support. The hospital social worker tried to help, but I was terrified they would take her away because I had no real way to care for her. So, I lied. I said I had family, that they were coming to help. She smiled sadly. They never came because they didn't exist. It was just us. Maria? Please let me finish. I need to say this. She finally looked at him. For 3 years, I've worked for you. And yes, the money was never enough. And yes, I was always exhausted, always worried. But you know what? You never raised your voice at me. Never treated me like I was less than human. Never touched me inappropriately or made me feel unsafe. The bar for decent behavior shouldn't be that low, Alexander said, troubled. But it is, Maria replied matter-of-factly. You don't know what it's like out there for women like me, Mr. Chen. I've worked for people who screamed at me over dust on a shelf. I've had men follow me into rooms and lock the door. I've been fired because I refused advances, and I've been fired because I didn't smile enough while being harassed. I've had wages withheld for imaginary infractions. I've been threatened with deportation if I complained, even though I'm here legally. She turned back to Sophia. So when you hired me through the agency, and you were just professional, respectful, absent most of the time actually, it felt like winning the lottery. You didn't see me, but you also didn't hurt me. And in my world, that counted as one of the better jobs. The weight of her words settled over Alexander like snow, cold and uncomfortable. This was the reality she'd been living while he'd been completely oblivious. That's not good enough, he said firmly. Being not terrible isn't the same as being fair. You deserve better than the bare minimum of human decency. Maria studied him for a long moment. What happened to you today, Mr. Chen? Really? Men like you don't usually show up at their maid's apartment. Don't usually spend a whole day in a hospital. Don't usually care. It was a fair question, one Alexander had been asking himself. Honestly, I don't have a good answer. Maybe it's because you'd never missed a day before, and that made me curious. Maybe it's because when I heard your voice through the door, something about it reminded me of my own mother when my father died. That sound of someone trying to hold it together when everything is falling apart. He sat down again, suddenly tired. Or maybe I'm just tired of being the person I've become. Someone so disconnected from reality that I didn't know the woman who keeps my life running couldn't afford to take her sick baby to the doctor. You're being too hard on yourself. Am I? Maria, I spend more on wine in a month than you make in a year. I have cars I forget I own. I own a vacation home I visited twice. And somehow, it never occurred to me to wonder if the person scrubbing my floors could afford to feed her child. I feed Sophia just fine, Maria said, a hint of pride in her voice. I know you do. You're an incredible mother, anyone can see that. But you shouldn't have to choose between paying rent and taking your daughter to the doctor. Nobody should have to make that choice. Sophia made a small sound and began to fuss. Immediately, Maria was there, lifting her gently. Show me more, Mama's here. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and even in her fevered state, she smiled at the sight of her mother. It was such a pure expression of love and trust that Alexander felt his throat tighten. May I hold her? The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Maria. You want to hold her? If that's okay. I promise I won't drop her. Maria hesitated, then carefully transferred Sophia to his arms, showing him how to support her head. The baby was surprisingly light, warm with fever, but no longer burning. She looked up at Alexander with curious dark eyes, studying this stranger with solemn attention. Hello, Sophia, he said softly. I'm Alexander. Well, I'm not sure what I am to you, but I'm going to try to help your mama take care of you. Sophia reached up and grabbed his finger with surprising strength. It was such a simple gesture, but it affected Alexander profoundly. This tiny person, trusting and vulnerable, depending entirely on the adults around her for everything. How many times had he made decisions that affected people like her, without ever considering the human cost? She likes you, Maria said, sounding surprised. How can you tell? She usually cries when strangers hold her. You must have a good energy. Or she's too sick to protest, Alexander said, but he smiled. They sat together in companionable silence, watching Sophia drift back to sleep. A nurse brought dinner for Maria, proper hospital food this time, since Alexander had arranged for her to be listed as a patient family member with full meal privileges. Mr. Chin, Maria said as she ate, what you said earlier about the health insurance and the salary, you meant that? Every word. My lawyer is drawing up the paperwork tomorrow. I don't understand why. Because it's right. Because I can afford to do it, and there's no good reason I shouldn't have been doing it all along. He looked at her directly. And because I want you to stop living in fear. Fear that your daughter will get sick and you can't afford to help her. Fear that you'll lose your job if you have a human emergency. Fear that one bad month will mean you can't make rent. I can't fix everything, Maria, but I can fix this. Tears welled in her eyes again. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me. You've earned every bit of this and more. He paused. Actually, there is one thing you can do for me. Anything. Tell me about Sophia. Tell me about your life outside my penthouse. I've been living with blinders on for 3 years. Help me see clearly. So Maria did. She told him about Sophia's first smile, her first laugh, the way she loved music and would dance in her bouncer even before she could walk. She told him about the tiny community of other single mothers at her building, how they helped each other with childcare and shared food when money was tight. She told him about her dreams for Sophia, college, a career, a life where she'd have choices Maria had never had. Alexander listened, and with every story, his understanding of Maria deepened. She wasn't just efficient and professional, she was resilient, creative, fiercely protective, and full of hope despite everything working against her. You know what I want, Maria said eventually, her voice soft. I want Sophia to grow up not knowing what it feels like to go to bed hungry. I want her to be able to go to the doctor when she's sick without me having to choose between that and keeping the lights on. I want her to believe that if she works hard and is kind, good things will happen to her. That's not too much to want, Alexander said. That should be the baseline. But it's not. Not for people like me. Then we need to change that, he said, and he meant it. Dawn broke over the hospital with the kind of gentle light that promised hope. Sophia's fever had finally broken completely around 4 a.m., and she'd slept peacefully through the rest of the night. Alexander had dozed fitfully in the chair, his body protesting the uncomfortable position, but he'd refused to leave. Maria had slept more deeply, exhausted by days of worry and sleepless nights. Dr. Winters arrived at 7 a.m. for her rounds, looking pleased with Sophia's progress. Her fever's been normal for over 3 hours now. Her ears look better. I think we can discharge you this afternoon if everything stays stable. Maria's relief was palpable. Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much. After Dr. Winters left, Alexander excused himself to make some calls. He found a quiet corner in the hospital's atrium, surrounded by expensive art and tropical plants that seemed absurdly lush for a building dedicated to illness. His first call was to his executive assistant, Jennifer. "Alexander," she answered, sounding both relieved and exasperated. "Where have you been? The Singapore office has been trying to reach you for 12 hours. The Morgan deal needs your signature. The board wants to know if you'll be at tomorrow's meeting. Jennifer, I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the week." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry, what?" "Clear my schedule. Everything. Delegate what can be delegated, postpone what can't. Alexander, you have 17 meetings scheduled over the next 3 days. 3 of them are with people who flew in specifically to see you. The Morgan deal alone is worth." "I know what it's worth, but something more important has come up." "More important than a $200 million acquisition?" Alexander looked back toward the ward where Maria and Sophia were. "Yes." Another pause. Jennifer had worked for him for 5 years, and he could practically hear her recalibrating. "All right. I'll do what I can. Should I tell people it's a family emergency?" "Tell them it's a personal matter that requires my immediate attention." That's honest enough. His second call was to his head of HR, David Osman. "David, I need you to review all of our household staff contracts. Not just mine, everyone's at the company who uses domestic workers through agencies." "Okay," David said slowly. "Can I ask what prompted this?" "I want to know if anyone else is being exploited the way my housekeeper was. And I want to know what it would cost to bring everyone in-house with full benefits." "That's going to be expensive, Alexander." "I didn't ask if it was expensive. I asked what it would cost. There's a difference." "Understood. I'll have a preliminary report by end of day." His third call was to his mother, who answered on the first ring. "Alexander, finally. I've been trying to reach you. I wanted to tell you about the most marvelous restaurant I found in Monte Carlo." "Mom, I need to tell you something." Something in his tone made her pause. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. But I need to ask you something. When I was growing up, did we have live-in staff?" "Of course, darling. You know we did. Rosa was our housekeeper for years, and there was Marcus who did the gardening, and... Do you remember if they had health insurance?" His mother sounded puzzled. "I assume so. Your father handled all of that. Why are you asking?" "What happened to Rosa after she stopped working for us?" "Oh, she retired. Your father gave her a very generous pension, I believe. She sent us a Christmas card every year until she passed away." "Alexander, what is this about? I'm trying to understand something. Dad was ruthless in business, but he took care of the people who worked directly for him, didn't he?" "Of course he did. He used to say that loyalty goes both ways. If you expect people to be loyal to you, you have to give them something worth being loyal to." She paused. "Darling, are you having some kind of crisis?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just waking up from a very long sleep." "That's very cryptic." "I know. I love you, Mom. I'll call you this weekend." Alexander, wait. But he'd already hung up. He had one more call to make, and this one was the hardest. He dialed his best friend, Marcus Wu, who'd been his college roommate and was now a civil rights attorney. "Alex. Long time. What's up?" "Marcus, hypothetical question. If someone has been working for an agency that's been taking 30% of their pay, classifying them as independent contractors to avoid providing benefits, and requiring them to work overtime without additional compensation, is that legal?" "Jesus. That's not hypothetical, is it?" "No." Marcus sighed. "It's complicated. A lot of it depends on the specifics of the contract, how the work is structured, whether the worker is truly independent or should be classified as an employee. But what you're describing, it walks right up to the line of wage theft and worker misclassification. In some cases, crosses it." "Why?" "Because I've been unknowingly participating in it for 3 years." "Shit, Alex. Okay, walk me through the details." Alexander did, and with each piece of information, Marcus's responses became more troubled. "Here's the thing," Marcus finally said. "You might not be legally liable. You hired through an agency. You paid what they told you to pay. The agency is the one potentially breaking labor laws. But morally, you've been benefiting from a system designed to exploit vulnerable workers. I know that now. So, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to make it right, starting with my employee and expanding from there. But Marcus, I need your help. I want to understand labor law better. I want to know what I can do to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just in my house but in my company. You're serious about this? Completely. All right. Let me buy you lunch next week, and we'll talk. I'll bring some materials. Fair warning, though, once you start seeing this stuff, you can't unsee it. I don't want to unsee it anymore, Alexander said. That's the whole point. When he returned to the hospital room, he found Sophia awake and much improved. Her eyes were bright, her fever gone, and she was actually smiling at her mother. Maria looked transformed, rested, hopeful. The crushing weight of fear lifted from her shoulders. Look at her, Maria said, her voice filled with joy. She's so much better. Alexander felt something warm spread through his chest. Pride? Happiness? Relief? He wasn't sure, but it felt good. I'm glad, he said simply. A nurse brought breakfast for Maria, eggs, toast, fruit, coffee. Hospital food, but Maria ate it like it was a feast. Alexander realized she probably never took time to eat proper breakfasts, always rushing to get to work, grabbing whatever was quick and cheap. Mr. Chin, Maria said between bites, you should go home. You've been here all night. You must be exhausted. I'm fine. You're wearing a $3,000 suit that you slept in. You have a board meeting to prepare for. You have a life to get back to. The suit can be dry cleaned. The board can wait. And my life will still be there tomorrow. He sat down in the chair that had become his spot. Besides, I want to be here when the doctor discharges you. I'm driving you home. Mr. Chen. Alexander. If we're going to be working together going forward, properly working together, you should call me Alexander. Maria looked uncertain. That doesn't feel right. Why not? Because you're my employer. There should be professional boundaries. There should be professional respect, Alexander corrected. But there should also be mutual recognition of each other's humanity. I call you Maria, not Ms. Santos. I'd like you to call me Alexander, at least when we're not in formal settings. I'll try. His lawyer, Marcus Chun, no relation to Alexander, arrived at noon with a briefcase full of documents. Alexander met him in the hospital cafeteria, and they spread the paperwork across a table in the corner. This is everything you requested, Marcus said, pushing folders across the table. Employment contract with full benefits package, including health, dental, and vision insurance. Paid time off, 3 weeks vacation, unlimited sick days. Retirement contribution matching. Life insurance. And this, he pulled out a separate document, is the back pay calculation for 3 years of unpaid overtime, plus the 30% the agency kept. Alexander looked at the final number and didn't flinch. It was substantial, but it was also what Maria had earned and never received. Perfect. Where do I sign? There's one more thing, Marcus said carefully. I took the liberty of drafting an additional document. A trust fund for Sophia's education. You mentioned you wanted to help ensure she could go to college. This sets aside funds specifically for that purpose. Tuition, books, housing, everything. It's irrevocable, meaning even if the employment relationship ends, the trust continues. Alexander hadn't asked for this, but the moment Marcus suggested it, he knew it was right. Include it. Alexander, you're aware that the total package you're offering, including the trust, is worth. I don't care what it's worth, Marcus. I care that it's fair. Marcus smiled. Your father would be proud of you, you know. This is exactly the kind of thing he would have done. Really? Because I'm starting to think I inherited his business sense, but forgot his values. You're remembering them now. That counts for something. They spent an hour going through every document, making sure Alexander understood each clause and term. When they finished, Marcus packed up his briefcase. One piece of advice, Marcus said. Make sure Maria understands this isn't charity. Make sure she knows she's earned every bit of this. Women like her, who've had to fight for everything, Sometimes it's harder for them to accept help than to keep struggling. How do I do that? Tell her the truth. That you were paying for her labor all along. The money just wasn't reaching her because of an exploitative system. This isn't generosity. It's correction. After Marcus left, Alexander returned to find Maria packing up Sophia's things. The baby was dressed in a clean onesie, looking healthy and happy, completely unaware of how close she'd come to serious complications. The doctor says we can go home, Maria announced. She wants to see Sophia again in 3 days, but she's cleared to leave. Good. My car is downstairs. I'll drive you. Mr. Chin Alexander, you've already done so much. I can take the bus. Maria, please. Let me do this. She searched his face, then nodded slowly. Okay. Thank you. The drive to Maria's apartment was quiet, Sophia sleeping peacefully in a car seat that Alexander had arranged to have delivered to the hospital. Proper, new, meeting all safety standards. Maria sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window as the neighborhoods changed from wealthy to working class. When they arrived at her building, Alexander carried Sophia up the stairs while Maria brought the bag of supplies and medications. Inside the small apartment, everything looked different to Alexander now. Where before he might have seen poverty, he now saw resilience. The carefully maintained space, the flowers in the window, the photos of Sophia on every surface, all evidence of a life built with determination and love. Would you like some coffee? Maria offered. It's not fancy like what you drink, but I'd love some, thank you. While she made coffee in the tiny kitchenette, Alexander sat on the futon with his briefcase. Sophia was awake now, watching him with those serious dark eyes. Maria, before you start work again, whenever you're ready, there's no rush. We need to go over some paperwork. He saw her shoulders tense slightly. Paperwork. Your new employment contract. I want you to read through it carefully. Take your time. If there's anything you don't understand or don't agree with, we can discuss it. Maria took the folder with trembling hands. She sat down next to him and began reading, her lips moving slightly as she processed the words. Alexander watched her expression change, confusion, disbelief, shock, then tears. This says I'll make 4 times what I was making before. That's roughly the correct market rate for an experienced household manager in the city, which is what you are. The previous arrangement was exploitation. And health insurance for both of us? Dental? Vision? Standard benefits that should have been provided from the start. 3 weeks paid vacation? You'll need to actually take it, Maria. That's not optional. She kept reading, and when she reached the section about back pay, she gasped. This number, Alexander, this is more money than I've seen in my entire life. It's what you earned but never received. The agency was taking 30% plus keeping you as a contractor to avoid paying overtime. That money was always yours. Maria was crying openly now, the pages shaking in her hands. I don't understand. Why would you do this? This is so much money. You could hire someone else for cheaper. You could. Maria, look at me. He waited until she met his eyes. This isn't charity. This isn't me being generous. This is correction. This is me fixing a system I should never have participated in. You work hard, you do your job excellently, and you deserve to be compensated fairly. That's all this is. But the trust fund for Sophia, she'd reached that document now. College, graduate school if she wants it, all expenses covered. Alexander, this is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every child deserves the chance to pursue education without drowning in debt. Sophia is a smart, beautiful little girl with a mother who would do anything for her. I'm just making sure that when she's 18, she has choices. Real choices. Maria set down the papers and buried her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. Not sad sobs, Alexander had heard those yesterday. These were different. These were the sobs of someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight finally being allowed to set it down. He didn't try to stop her or comfort her with empty words. He just sat there, understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness is witnessing someone's relief without trying to minimize it. When she finally looked up, her face was blotchy and her eyes swollen, but there was something new in her expression. Hope. Real, tangible hope. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You already have. You've kept my life running smoothly for 3 years. You've worked harder than anyone should have to work. You've raised a beautiful daughter alone. You've done everything right, Maria. The world just wasn't fair to you. I'm trying to make a tiny portion of it more fair. Will this change things between us? The way we work together?" "I hope so," Alexander said honestly. "I hope it means you feel comfortable telling me when you need time off, or when Sophia is sick, or when something in your life needs attention. I hope it means you see me as someone who values you, not just someone who pays you. But the core of our arrangement stays the same. You help manage my household. I compensate you fairly for that work." Maria picked up a pen with shaking hands. "Where do I sign?" They went through each document together, Alexander explaining anything she had questions about. When they finished, Maria held Sophia close and looked at him with an expression that was part gratitude, part disbelief, part something else he couldn't quite name. "My whole life," she said softly, "I've been told that if I work hard enough, if I'm good enough, things will get better. But they never did. I worked 3 jobs when I was pregnant and barely scraped by. I've worked for you for 3 years, and until yesterday, I was one emergency away from homelessness." She kissed Sophia's head. "I'd started to think that maybe hard work wasn't enough. That maybe the world was just set up for people like me to fail." "The world is set up unfairly," Alexander acknowledged. "But that doesn't mean we can't change our small corner of it." "You've changed everything for us," Maria said. "Everything. And I know you say it's just fair compensation, but Alexander, you didn't have to notice. You didn't have to care. You didn't have to spend a whole day in a hospital with your maid's sick baby. Most people wouldn't have." "Then most people are missing out," Alexander said. "Because this, helping you, meeting Sophia, understanding your life, has been more meaningful to me than any business deal I've ever done." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Sophia playing with her mother's fingers, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window that didn't quite close all the way. Alexander made a mental note to have that fixed, properly fixed, not just a temporary patch. "When should I come back to work?" Maria asked. "Whenever you're ready. Take the rest of the week at least. Sophia needs to fully recover, and you need to rest. The house will survive a few days without being perfect." "Are you sure?" "Maria, you have sick days now. Unlimited sick days. This is exactly what they're for." She smiled, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "I'm going to have to get used to this new reality." "We both are," Alexander said. "I'm going to have to get used to being the kind of employer I should have been all along." Before he left, Sophia reached out and grabbed his finger again, holding on with surprising strength. Alexander looked down at this tiny person who had inadvertently changed the course of his life. "Thank you, Sophia," he whispered, "for being sick at exactly the right time." Maria laughed. "That's a terrible thing to thank her for." "You know what I mean." "I do." She walked him to the door. "Alexander, I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to be the best household manager you've ever seen." "You already are, Maria. You always have been. I was just too blind to see it." As he drove home through the city, he thought he'd known. Alexander realized that everything looked different now. The people waiting at bus stops, the workers leaving late shifts, the parents pushing strollers, he saw them all with new eyes. Each one had a story, struggles, dreams. Each one mattered. His phone buzzed with messages. His executive team, wondering where he'd been. His mother, worried about their strange conversation. Board members, investors, clients. The whole apparatus of his business empire, continuing to turn whether he was actively managing it or not. He'd spent his entire adult life believing he was indispensable, that everything would fall apart without his constant attention. But the truth was, the business ran fine. What had almost fallen apart was his humanity. Tomorrow, he'd start making bigger changes. He'd talk to his HR department about reviewing all contractor relationships. He'd look into the agencies his company used and make sure they weren't exploiting workers. He'd think about what it meant to be a billionaire in a world where people like Maria had to choose between rent and medical care. But tonight, he was just grateful. Grateful that he'd noticed Maria's absence. Grateful that he'd cared enough to investigate. Grateful that he'd been given the chance to do better. Sometimes, Alexander thought as he pulled into his garage, the most important meetings aren't in boardrooms. Sometimes they happen in tiny apartments and hospital rooms, when we finally open our eyes to the people we've been looking past our whole lives. 3 weeks later, Alexander stood in his home office reviewing a proposal that would have seemed impossible a month ago. His head of HR, David, sat across from him looking both impressed and slightly shell-shocked. "So let me make sure I understand correctly," David said, adjusting his glasses. "You want to audit every domestic worker contract in the entire company, bring all of them in-house with full benefits, and create a scholarship fund for their children's education?" "That's correct." "Do you have any idea what this is going to cost?" "Approximately $18 million in the first year, declining to around $12 million annually after that, based on your projections." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Less than 3% of our annual profit. Barely a rounding error. It's not about whether we can afford it." "Then what is it about, David?" The HR director hesitated. "Precedent. If we do this, other companies might feel pressure to follow suit. It could disrupt the entire domestic staffing industry." "Good," Alexander said flatly. "The entire domestic staffing industry is built on exploitation. If we disrupt it, maybe some of those workers will finally get paid what they're worth. The board is going to have questions. Let them ask. I'll have answers." Alexander stood and walked to the window. Below, he could see Maria in the garden with Sophia. They'd converted one of the unused ground floor rooms into a nursery, complete with a baby monitor that connected to Maria's phone, so she could check on Sophia while working. The baby was thriving, her ear infection a fading memory. And Maria had transformed. With proper sleep, nutrition, and the security of knowing her daughter was cared for, she'd blossomed. She still maintained Alexander's home with the same attention to detail, but now there was lightness to her movements, quick smiles, spontaneous laughter when she played with Sophia. It was like watching a plant that had been barely surviving suddenly get the water and sunlight it needed. "There's something else," Alexander said, turning back to David. "I want to start a foundation. Focus on supporting single parents, particularly single mothers. Childcare assistance, job training, legal aid, emergency financial support. I want to create a safety net for people who are falling through the cracks." David made notes, his expression thoughtful. "That's actually a brilliant idea. The tax benefits alone would be significant, not to mention the positive PR." "I don't care about the PR," Alexander said sharply. "This isn't a publicity stunt. I don't want our name plastered all over it. I want it to actually help people." "Of course. I didn't mean to suggest." "I know you didn't. Sorry." Alexander rubbed his temples. "I'm just frustrated. The more I learn about how many people are struggling in the city, in this country, while people like me accumulate wealth we couldn't spend in 10 lifetimes, it's infuriating." "You can't fix everything, Alexander." "No. But I can fix some things. And I can try to do business in a way that doesn't make the problem worse." He pulled up a document on his computer. "I've been talking to Marcus Wu, the civil rights attorney. He's helping me understand labor law better. Did you know that in most of our supplier contracts, there's nothing requiring fair treatment of workers? We could be buying from companies that exploit their employees, and we'd never know. Most companies don't audit their suppliers for labor practices beyond basic legal compliance. Then most companies are complicit in exploitation. I want to change that, at least for us. New supplier requirements. Fair wages, safe working conditions, no union busting. If they can't meet those standards, we find new suppliers." David was writing rapidly now. "This is going to require a complete overhaul of our procurement process." "So, we overhaul it. What's the point of being successful if we're building that success on other people's suffering?" A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Maria entered, carrying a tray with coffee and pastries. She'd started doing this during Alexander's meetings. Not because he'd asked, but because she seemed to genuinely enjoy taking care of these details. "I thought you might want a break," she said, setting down the tray. "Perfect timing as always." "Thank you, Maria." Alexander noticed David watching the interaction with interest. "David, you know Maria, of course." "Of course. Good to see you, Maria." "You as well, Mr. Osman." She smiled and turned to leave, but Alexander stopped her. "Actually, Maria, would you mind staying for a minute? I'd like your input on something." She looked surprised. "My input?" "Yes. We're discussing the Workers' Support Initiative. You have first-hand experience with the challenges single parents face. Your perspective would be valuable." Maria glanced at David uncertainly, then at Alexander. "You want me to participate in a business meeting? If you're comfortable with it. You don't have to, but I think you'd have insights we'd miss otherwise." She hesitated, then took a seat on the edge of the sofa. Alexander noticed how she held herself, present but cautious, as if expecting to be dismissed at any moment. "What we're trying to understand," Alexander explained, "is what would actually help single parents in difficult situations. Not what we think would help, but what actually would. What made the difference for you?" Maria thought for a moment. "Honestly, the biggest thing was stability. Knowing that if Sophia got sick, I wouldn't lose my job. Knowing that I could take her to the doctor, without choosing between that and paying rent. Security is what changes everything." "What about childcare?" David asked, jumping in. "We were discussing subsidized childcare as part of the program." "Childcare is critical," Maria agreed. "But it has to be quality childcare, not just cheap. And it has to be flexible. Single parents often work irregular hours. Most daycare centers close at 6 p.m. What if you work until 8? What if you work weekends?" "What would have helped you the most?" Alexander asked. "If you could design the perfect support system." Maria's eyes lit up with a combination of passion and pain, the look of someone who'd thought about this question many times in the dark hours of desperate nights. "Emergency funds," she said immediately. "Not loans, actual grants. Because when your car breaks down and you need it to get to work, or when your baby spikes a 104 fever and needs to go to the ER, you can't wait for loan approval. You need help now. And that help can mean the difference between keeping your life together and everything falling apart." David was taking notes. How much would constitute a meaningful emergency fund? For most people, $500 to $1,000. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's everything. It's the difference between a crisis and an inconvenience. "What else?" Alexander prompted. "Legal assistance. So many single mothers are trapped in situations with absent fathers who won't pay child support, or in bad housing situations, or dealing with debt collectors. But lawyers are expensive. Having access to legal help without worrying about cost would be huge." "Job training," David suggested. Maria nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, but here's the thing. It has to include childcare during the training. And it has to lead to actual jobs, not just certificates that sound good but don't translate to employment. And it has to account for the fact that some of us don't have the luxury of taking unpaid internships or starting at the bottom of a career ladder. We need training that leads quickly to living wages." Alexander listened, fascinated. This was the kind of practical wisdom that never came up in board meetings or strategic planning sessions. This was reality unfiltered. "Healthcare navigation," Maria continued, warming to the topic now. "The healthcare system is so complicated. Even with insurance now, I sometimes don't know where to go or what's covered. Having someone who could help navigate that, explain bills, find the right specialists, that would be invaluable." They talked for another 30 minutes, Maria sharing insights from her own experience and from conversations with other single parents in her building and community. David filled several pages with notes. When Maria finally excused herself to check on Sophia, David looked at Alexander with newfound respect. "That was incredibly valuable," he said. "We need to hire consultants with lived experience like that for this foundation." "We need to do more than hire consultants," Alexander said. "We need to put people with lived experience in leadership positions. People who understand these issues from the inside." "You're thinking of Maria?" "Among others, yes.
She's brilliant, David.
She's been managing complex logistics in my home for years. She thinks systematically, anticipates problems, finds creative solutions. The only difference between her and any executive in this building is opportunity. David nodded slowly. You've changed, Alexander. A month ago, you would never have included a housekeeper in a strategic planning meeting. A month ago, I was ignorant and arrogant. I'm trying to be better. After David left, Alexander found Maria in the nursery, playing with Sophia on a colorful mat. The baby was babbling happily, reaching for toys suspended above her. Thank you for including me in that meeting, Maria said without looking up. But you don't have to do that. I know my place. Your place? Alexander sat down on the floor across from her, much to Sophia's delight. Maria, you're one of the smartest, most capable people I know. Your place is wherever you want it to be. I'm a housekeeper, Alexander. I didn't go to college. I don't have any fancy degrees or business experience. You have something more valuable, real experience with the problems we're trying to solve. You're the expert we need. Maria finally looked at him. Why are you doing all this? The foundation, the worker initiative, everything. Because I can. Because I should. Because you showed me that my way of living was built on a fundamentally unjust system, and I can't unsee that now. You're going to make yourself unpopular with other wealthy people. Alexander laughed.
Good.
Maybe they need to be uncomfortable. You're serious about this, aren't you? This isn't just a phase that will fade when you get bored or busy. Maria, look at me. He waited until she met his eyes. You and Sophia changed my life. Not because you asked for anything or demanded anything, but because you showed me what real courage and resilience look like. You showed me what it means to keep going when everything is stacked against you. I can't go back to being the person I was before. I don't want to. Sophia chose that moment to roll over for the first time, pushing herself up on her little arms and looking tremendously proud of herself. Both adults gasped and clapped, celebrating this milestone with the kind of joy that transcends circumstances. She's growing so fast, Maria said softly, scooping up her daughter and covering her face with kisses.
She is.
And she's going to grow up in a different world than the one you grew up in. A world where she has opportunities, support, security. Alexander smiled at Sophia, who grinned back with her two tiny teeth. Not because her mother worked herself to death trying to provide, but because her mother had the support she deserved all along. That evening, Alexander attended a charity gala, the kind of event he'd been to hundreds of times before. Crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, champagne flowing freely. Everyone who was anyone in the city's elite circles was there, writing checks to feel good about themselves while changing nothing fundamental about the systems that created the need for charity in the first place. But tonight, Alexander saw it all differently. He watched a real estate developer joke about driving up rents in up-and-coming neighborhoods like Maria's, where families would be displaced by his improvements. He listened to a tech CEO complain about the difficulty of finding good domestic help. They're all so unreliable these days. He heard a politician promise to cut business taxes while simultaneously claiming to care about working families. Alexander, a familiar voice cut through his thoughts. Thomas Waterford, an old business school friend who now ran a private equity firm. Haven't seen you at any of these things lately. Where have you been hiding? Just busy, Alexander replied neutrally. I heard about your little labor initiative. Very progressive of you. Thomas's tone suggested he didn't mean it as a compliment. Trying to win some kind of humanitarian award? Actually, I'm trying to stop exploiting the people who work for me. Thomas laughed, then realized Alexander wasn't joking. Come on, Alex. Don't tell me you've gone soft. Those labor agencies exist for a reason, to handle all the messy stuff, so we don't have to. The messy stuff being fair pay and basic benefits? It's the market rate. The market rate is artificially depressed by a system designed to keep vulnerable workers desperate and powerless, Alexander interrupted. And I'm not participating in it anymore. You're going to put yourself at a competitive disadvantage.
How?
By paying my household staff fairly? That has zero impact on my company's competitiveness. And honestly, Thomas, even if it did, so what? What's the point of being successful if we have to crush people to do it? Thomas stared at him like he'd grown a second head. What happened to you? I met someone who showed me what real struggle looks like. Someone who was working for me while one emergency away from disaster, and I never even noticed. Your housekeeper, Thomas said, and something in his tone made Alexander's jaw clench. Her name is Maria. She's a single mother who's been fighting her entire life for opportunities that you and I got handed on a silver platter. She's brilliant, hardworking, and she deserves better than the scraps our system throws her. You're sleeping with your maid, Thomas concluded with a smirk. Alexander felt fury rise in his chest, white-hot and righteous. No, Thomas, I'm not. I'm recognizing her humanity. I'm seeing her as a person instead of a convenience. You should try it sometime. He walked away before he said something he'd regret, or before he punched Thomas in his smug face. But as he left the gala early, Alexander realized something important. He was done with this world. Done pretending that accumulating wealth was the only thing that mattered. Done with social circles where compassion was seen as weakness and exploitation was just good business. He had a new purpose now, and it started with making sure that women like Maria never again had to choose between their children's health and paying rent. 6 months after that day in the hospital, Alexander stood in a community center in Maria's neighborhood, watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Santos Foundation. Maria had initially protested the name. It should be the Chin Foundation, she'd insisted, but Alexander had been firm. This was her vision, her experience, her understanding that made it possible. Her name should be on it. The foundation's first office was modest but well-equipped, staffed by a mix of professionals and people with lived experience of poverty and single parenthood. They'd already distributed 42 emergency grants, provided legal assistance to 18 families, and enrolled 35 people in job training programs that actually led to employment. Maria stood beside him, wearing a professional dress that he'd helped her pick out. Not because she needed help, she had excellent taste, but because she'd been nervous about speaking in front of the crowd. She was now the foundation's associate director, a role she'd initially insisted she wasn't qualified for until Alexander had shown her job descriptions for similar positions and proved that her experience exceeded most of the requirements. Are you ready? He asked quietly. No, she admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. She stepped up to the microphone, Sophia balanced on her hip. The baby was almost 14 months old now, walking and babbling and charming everyone she met. 6 months ago, Maria began, her voice shaking slightly, my daughter got very sick. I spent 3 days trying to bring her fever down with over-the-counter medicine because I couldn't afford to take her back to the doctor. I was terrified. I was exhausted. And I was completely alone. The crowd was silent, listening. I didn't call in sick to work because I thought I'd be fired. I'd seen it happen to other women. One emergency, and suddenly you're replaced. So I tried to handle it myself, and my baby got sicker. If Alexander, hadn't shown up at my apartment that day, I don't know what would have happened. She paused, gathering herself. But here's the thing that haunts me. I was one of the lucky ones. I had an employer who cared enough to ask why I'd missed work. Most people don't. Most single mothers face these crises alone, with no safety net, no support, no one checking if they're okay. Alexander watched people in the audience nodding, many of them single mothers themselves. This foundation exists because someone finally saw me. Not just as a worker, not just as a service provider, but as a whole person with a whole life. And once I was seen, once I was supported, everything changed. Maria looked directly at Alexander. I'm not special. I'm not uniquely deserving. Every single parent, every struggling family deserves the same chance I got. She held up a stack of applications. We've received over 300 requests for assistance in the 2 weeks since we announced this foundation. 300 families in this neighborhood alone who are hanging on by their fingernails. We can't help all of them yet. But we're going to help as many as we can, and we're going to work to change the systems that created their struggles in the first place. The applause was thunderous. Alexander found himself blinking back tears as he watched Maria, confident, articulate, passionate, standing there as living proof that all most people need is a fair chance. After the ceremony, they were mobbed by reporters. The story had captured public imagination, billionaire employer and former housekeeper teaming up to fight poverty. It was feel-good fodder for the news cycle, though Alexander knew the real work would be much harder and less photogenic than ribbon cuttings and press releases. Mr. Chen. A reporter thrust a microphone at him. Some of your fellow CEOs have criticized this initiative, saying it's naive and economically unsustainable. How do you respond? I'd say that any economic system that requires people to work full-time and still live in poverty is the unsustainable one, Alexander replied. We're the richest country in human history. The fact that we have working families who can't afford healthcare or housing isn't a failure of resources, it's a failure of priorities. What about accusations that you're only doing this for good publicity? Alexander smiled. If good publicity comes from treating people fairly and paying living wages, maybe more companies should try it. Maria was being interviewed by a different reporter, Sophia squirming in her arms. What's your message to other single mothers? The reporter asked. That you're not alone. That you deserve support, not judgment. That if you're working as hard as you can and it's still not enough, that's not your failure. That's the system failing you. Maria shifted Sophia to her other hip. And that change is possible. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here. I couldn't have imagined a life where I didn't go to bed every night terrified about money. But I'm living that life now, and I want every other single parent to have that same security. That evening, Alexander hosted a small dinner at his home, a home that had transformed along with everything else. The formal dining room now had a high chair at the table. The pristine white furniture had been replaced with more practical, comfortable pieces. And the house rules about no children had been completely rewritten. Maria's former neighbors from her old building were there, along with some of the foundation's first grant recipients, the foundation staff, and a few of Alexander's friends who'd supported the initiative. Sophia toddled around, delighting everyone, completely unaware that she'd been the catalyst for all of this change. I can't believe this is the same house, one of Maria's old neighbors, Rosa, said as she looked around. When Maria first told us she worked here, we pictured something cold and intimidating. It was, Alexander admitted. Everything was chosen for appearance, not comfort, not life. It took a wise woman and her baby to show me that a home should be lived in, not just looked at. Over dinner, catered by a company that Alexander had personally vetted to ensure they paid their workers fairly, the conversation turned to next steps. We're getting requests from other cities, said Jennifer Lee, the foundation's program director. People who want to replicate this model. We should help them, Maria said immediately. Share what we've learned, what works, what doesn't. We should think bigger, Alexander added. This foundation is helping hundreds of families. But there are millions in the same situation. We need systemic change. Like what? Asked Marcus Wu, who joined the foundation's board. Like lobbying for living wage laws. Like supporting union organizing. Like fighting for universal childcare and healthcare. Alexander counted on his fingers. Like pressuring other companies to treat their workers fairly. Like using our platform to change the conversation about poverty from people need to work harder to people need to be paid what their work is worth. That's a tall order, Marcus said, but he was smiling. So was helping 300 families in 6 months, but we did it. Alexander looked around the table. We have resources, connections, and most importantly, we have people like Maria who understand the problems from the inside. We can make a difference. You really believe that? Rosa asked. That things can actually change? 6 months ago, I was living in ignorance while the woman who kept my life running was struggling to survive, Alexander said. Now we're running a foundation together, and her daughter has a secure future. If that can change, anything can change. Later, after the guests had left, Alexander and Maria sat in the living room while Sophia slept in the nursery upstairs. Yes, she stayed over sometimes now, especially on late nights when Maria worked on foundation business. Thank you, Maria said softly. For what? You've thanked me 100 times. For seeing me. For caring. For changing your entire life because my daughter got sick. She smiled. I still can't quite believe this is real sometimes. I keep waiting to wake up back in that tiny apartment, behind on rent, terrified about the future. It's real.
And you earned it, Maria.
Every bit of it. We earned it, she corrected. You could have written a check and felt good about yourself. Instead, you actually changed. You learned. You listened. That's rare, Alexander. Especially for someone in your position. I had a good teacher. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling. So much had changed, yet in some ways, things were the same. Maria still managed his household, though now with proper compensation and support. She still anticipated his needs and kept everything running smoothly. But the dynamic had shifted from employer-servant to something more like partners, each bringing their strengths to shared goals. Can I ask you something? Maria said. That day, when you showed up at my apartment, what made you come? Really? Alexander thought about it. Honestly, I'm not sure. Part of it was annoyance that my routine was disrupted. Part of it was curiosity. You'd never missed a day before. But I think underneath all that, there was something else. A small voice asking why I'd never thought to ask about your life, your struggles, your story. And once I heard that voice, I couldn't ignore it. I'm glad you didn't. Me too. He looked at her seriously. You changed my life, Maria. You and Sophia. I was successful, wealthy, comfortable, and completely disconnected from anything that mattered. You showed me what actually matters. What's that?
People. Connection.
Using what you have to help others. Building something that lasts beyond quarterly earnings reports. He smiled. I make less money now than I did before. Did you know that? Between the foundation, the worker initiative at my company, and the new supplier requirements, my personal income has dropped about 30%. Does that bother you? Not even a little. I have more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes anyway. What I didn't have before was purpose. Now I do. Sophia's voice came through the baby monitor, not crying, just babbling to herself as she sometimes did. They both smiled at the sound. She's going to grow up so different from how I grew up, Maria marveled. She'll never know what it's like to be hungry, to be scared about housing, to watch her mother choose between medicine and food. Is that wrong? Should she understand struggle? She'll understand struggle, Alexander said. Just different struggles. And you'll teach her empathy, compassion, the importance of helping others. She'll know her mother fought hard to give her opportunities. That's not a bad foundation. I want her to use those opportunities well, to give back.
She will.
She has you as an example. The baby monitor crackled again, and this time Sophia was definitely fussing. Maria stood to go to her, but Alexander waved her back down. Let me. I need practice anyway. He climbed the stairs to the nursery, where Sophia was standing in her crib, holding onto the rail. When she saw him, her face lit up in a smile that never failed to melt his heart. Hey, little one, he said softly, picking her up. What's wrong? Can't sleep? Sophia babbled at him, a stream of sounds that almost seemed like they should mean something. He walked her around the room, swaying gently, and she settled against his shoulder with a contented sigh. This child, this tiny person who'd been suffering from an ear infection 6 months ago, had changed everything. Not through any action of her own, but simply by being vulnerable at the right moment. By being loved so fiercely by her mother that Alexander couldn't look away. By being the catalyst that cracked open his comfortable ignorance. You're going to do great things someday, he whispered to her. But you've already done something pretty great. You helped a stubborn billionaire remember how to be human. Sophia yawned widely, her little hand curling around his collar. He continued to rock her, in no hurry to put her down. Through the window, he could see the city lights sprawling into the distance. Millions of people living millions of stories, each one as complex and important as his own. How many Mariahs were out there, struggling in silence? How many Sophias were suffering because the adults around them couldn't see past their own privilege? The questions used to feel overwhelming, paralyzing. But now Alexander understood that you didn't have to solve everything to make a difference. You just had to start. You had to see one person help one family change one system. The ripples spread from there. By the time Sophia was fully asleep, Alexander's arms were cramping, but he stood there a few minutes longer anyway, memorizing this moment. Then, he carefully placed her back in her crib, covering her with the soft blanket Maria had made by hand during her pregnancy. Downstairs, he found Maria had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the long day. He considered waking her, then decided against it. Instead, he draped a throw blanket over her and dimmed the lights. Standing there in his living room, a room that now contained toys and baby gates and all the beautiful mess of real life, Alexander Chin reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From disconnected billionaire to someone who understood, at least a little bit, what it meant to live with purpose beyond profit. He'd asked why his maid had missed work, and in answering that simple question, he discovered a truth that had shattered his comfortable illusions and rebuilt him into someone better. Someone who saw people instead of just their functions in his life. Someone who understood that real wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts but in connections, in positive impact, in lives changed for the better. The road ahead was long. The problems were vast. But for the first time in his life, Alexander felt like he was walking in the right direction. All because one day, he'd noticed that his coffee wasn't made, and he'd cared enough to ask why. Sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest acts of attention. Sometimes all it takes to change a life, or 2 lives, or 1,000, is to actually see the people who've been invisible in plain sight. And sometimes, the person who needs saving isn't the one you expect. Alexander had thought he was helping Maria that day in the hospital. But the truth was, she'd saved him too, from a life of comfortable oblivion, from the slow death of a heart that had forgotten how to feel, from the prison of wealth without meaning. He picked up his phone and made a note. Tomorrow, call the mayor's office about universal child care initiative. Follow up with Marcus about living wage legislation. Review applications for the foundation's next grant cycle. The work would never be done. There would always be more people to help, more systems to change, more ignorance in himself and others to confront. But tonight, in this house that had finally become a home, with Maria sleeping peacefully on his couch and Sophia dreaming safely upstairs, Alexander Chin felt something he'd been missing for too long. He felt awake. He felt alive. He felt like he mattered for reasons beyond his net worth. And it had all started with one simple question. Why did she miss work? The answer had left him in tears. But those tears had watered the seeds of something beautiful, compassion, justice, and the understanding that we're all connected, all responsible for each other, all capable of creating change if we're brave enough to see beyond ourselves. This was just the beginning. The Santos Foundation continues its work today, having helped over 5,000 families and inspired similar initiatives in 15 cities across the country. Sophia Santos Chun, yes, Alexander legally adopted her when she was 3, with Maria's blessing, is now 7 years old and tells everyone she wants to be a doctor when she grows up, so she can help sick kids like she was helped. Maria Santos serves as the foundation's director and speaks nationally about poverty, single parenthood, and economic justice. Alexander Chin divides his time between his company, which has become a leader in ethical business practices, and the foundation's expansion efforts. He says he's never been busier, poorer, or happier in his life.